The March unemployment numbers are released. My next guest has some thoughts on the specifics that investors will be watching for come Friday morning. He's Russ, Chief Investment Strategist at iShares. iShares is owned by BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset manager, overseeing $3.56 trillion. Russ joins us from San Francisco. Russ, welcome to Bloomberg's Bottom Line. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Russ, before we get into the jobs number, I was wondering if we might take a quick peek there at consumer spending, because we see that it rose more than forecast in numbers that were put out today. Are we seeing the consumer finally making his and her presence known in this economy? Because it has been a while.
Yeah, I actually don't think so. I think that the consumers held up better than most people have expected, far better than I've expected. But there are a couple of reasons for this which I don't think are permanent. One of which is the consumer's been helped because banks have been doing a lot of the deleveraging work for consumers. They've been writing down consumer debt to the tune of about $800 billion over the past several years. Second of all, the government is helping out quite a bit as well. So when you look at disposable income, it's being inflated and flattered by what are known as transfer payments, which are effectively checks from the federal government. Now, we all know that can't continue indefinitely given the deficit. So my assumption is that over the longer term, consumers are going to have to pare back a little bit more than they have over the past 6 or 12 months.
Is that what you might be most concerned with regarding the health of the economy going forward?
Well, it's one of the two. I think that when I look at the U.S. economy right now, we have a recovery. It's a self-sustaining recovery. Inflation is low. Interest rates are low. That's all the good news. The two big risks for me are, one, the U.S. consumer, still carrying too much debt relative to income, and the other is the government, who is really carrying too much debt relative to their revenue, and that is a long-term systemic risk for the economy.
And speaking of the government, we do have, again, another threat of a government shutdown. How do you think that's going to play out, if you can put on your political prognosticator's cap for just a moment?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously, it's become a political issue. My assumption is that we're going to see a compromise, and probably we're going to kick this can down the road. In other words, I think we'll have a spending compromise between Republicans and Democrats. No grand deal yet. And when you look at the history of these types of budget issues, typically they don't get fully addressed until after an election. So it would be unusual to see any type of large fiscal reform until 2013, in my opinion.
Russ, we mentioned that jobs report, the March jobs report coming out on Friday. At this point, you still believe that people should be focused on hourly earnings as a better gauge of what's going on?
Well, again, this is the interesting point going back to what the government is doing. Hourly earnings are very critical because, again, this tells you how much disposable income, how much purchasing power consumers have. Now, hourly earnings are growing very slowly. What's interesting is disposable income is growing much faster. And the reason for that, again, is that the government is subsidizing income. So while hourly earnings are important, it's also important to watch these transfer payments. That's what's helping consumers out, helping them make ends meet.
Russ, if I might ask in our last minute, let's switch to the Federal Reserve here. The Fed winding down its asset purchase program. What should investors be looking for when the Fed finally does that?
Well, this is obviously going to put a little bit more pressure on the U.S. Treasury market. The Fed has been one of the supporters of that market over the past several months. I think the good news for investors is that there's still a lack of demand from private borrowers, which means that while the government does have these huge deficits to finance, they're finding there's not much competition for capital from companies, from individuals. Banks are big buyers of treasuries, and I think this will help the bond market over the near term. But as we get into 2012, then I think there's more to worry about.
Russ Koesterich, he is the Chief Investment Strategist at iShares, joining us from San Francisco. Russ, a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much.